All right. We ready? Yeah, kind of. How about a yes? Come on, Max, please. Week 4 enthusiasm, it's all gone. That's really sad. All right. Well, I'm ready. Stop chatting, and we're going to start on what I promised you would be a hard lecture. This is almost like a humorous thing now. All right, come on, go next page. Here we go. So what we did last time in the lecture before last is we derived demand, right? We took our set of complete, transitive, and Morse better type preferences, looked at different combinations of price, so 3 different levels of the price of Hershey's holding income and the price of Reese's constant, showed how the budget constraint rotated out as price dropped, and then looked at the optimal bundle of Reese's and Hershey's for each one of these 3 prices of Hershey's. Your neighbors are hating you right now if you're talking. I'm telling you that. I don't care, but your neighbors are. So as the price of Hershey's decreased, budget constraint rotated out, and the demand of Hershey's went up. There's something called the law of demand, which means as the price of a commodity goes down, holding everything else constant, the quantity demanded goes up. Of course, any laws are there to be broken at some point. There's something called a Giffen good, which we talked about for a brief amount of time, which suggests that there's one type of good called a Giffen good. If price increases, you actually consume more of it, or if price decreases, you consume less of it, holding everything else constant, right? So that violates the law of demand. But for most goods we consume, the more expensive, the less you consume. Then we derive something different, which is called the Engel curve, right? Demand shows you a relationship between quantity and price of a good holding income and the price of all other goods constant. The Engel curve holds both prices constant and lets income vary. So as you shift out the budget constraint, think of it as your grandma sending you $20 bills twice. Your budget constraint shifts out parallel. We plotted what consumption bundles, meaning what combination of Hershey's and Reese's you would consume at these different budget constraints, and then plotted the optimal quantity of Hershey's you consume against income. Of course, the figure shows you also the optimal number of Reese's consumed for different levels of income, and you could plot the Engel curve for Reese's as well from that graph. Then we talked a little bit about normal versus inferior goods. If income goes up and you consume more of a good, that's a normal good. If income goes up and you consume less of a good, that's an inferior good. So chocolate versus cup of noodles. Then I closed with this notion of a backward bending Engel curve, which means that a good, to some people, can be both a normal and an inferior good, just depends on over what range of income. So if you're really, really poor and you're hungry all the time, you may, as your income goes up a little bit, at this point actually buy more cup of noodles, right? But once you get your job at some fancy consulting firm or wherever you're going to work next, your consumption of cup of noodles actually goes down. So for increases of incomes at low levels of income, a good may be normal, but then as income goes up further, the good may become inferior over that range of income. So a good can be both. That turned out to be important, not just conceptually, but in a model of labor versus leisure that we're going to see at the end of today. All right, so this is where we are. What I want to do now is maybe the most difficult thing in this entire class. Right? People hate this. So try and be open-minded. This is a bit tricky, and this makes your brain run at like the same number of RPMs that a Formula 1 engine runs at, but you can figure it out. All right? So what I want to think about with you now is the effect of a price change. So if you look at your current consumption bundle, if you hold your income constant, your nominal income, the number of dollars in your wallet, you hold the price of one of the 2 goods you're consuming constant, let's say the price of Reese's, and if the price of Hershey's changes, I'm going to argue that 2 things happen. Right? The 2 things that are going to happen is, one, you have the same amount of real income. Right? Nominal income stays the same. Price of Reese's stays the same, but the price of Hershey's increases. Do you have the same purchasing power as you had before? No. Right? Real income, in some sense, is just a way of thinking about, given how much income do you have, if you adjust for prices, what bundles or what set of bundles can you buy? So what happens to your opportunity set, that triangle that starts at 0, 0 and is bounded by your budget constraint, as the price of Hershey's increases, that opportunity set shrinks. Right? So your real income level goes down because of that price income. The tricky thing that happens at the same time, though, is if only one of the prices increases, what happens to the exchange rate between the 2 goods? Does it stay the same? No, right? It changes. So if Hershey's, all of a sudden, double in price, you're going to have to sacrifice twice as many Reese's for one more Hershey's as you did before, right? The exchange rate changed. So what this means is 2 things happen to you because of this one change in the world you live in, right? The price changed, one parameter changed, but 2 things happen that determine your behavior. A, you have less real income, your opportunity set shrinks, and B, the ratio at which the market lets you trade one good for the other has changed. Not the ratio, the rate at which the market lets you trade one good for another changed. So what I'm going to do is a thought experiment, right? So I started teaching here in 2003, it's 2014, so this is the 11th time minus sabbatical, 10th time I taught this class. No, once I made me teach an extra one, 11. And every year I try and make it better, and every year it gets worse. So I'm going to try and make it better again, okay? I want to make it absolutely clear, what I'm about to explain to you is not something that really goes through your mind, all right? I'm going to show you that we can break how you respond to a change in the price of one good, holding everything constant, into 2 effects. This is not something you do consciously. This is not something you would come up with on your own. This is something a guy named Slutsky came up with a long time ago. Americans call him Slutsky, and I have a very good friend from Kazakhstan, and the instructor in the grad program I was at kept on saying Slutsky, 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 and the guy with a bright red head jumps up on his chair in the middle of lecture, big guy, like 250 pounds, you know, pure muscle, bright red head, his name is not Slutsky, his name is Slutsky. So I ask you to please call this the person who came up with this idea Slutsky as well. So the idea here is one where I'm going to break how you change your consumption of Hershey's in response to a change in the price of Hershey's into 2 steps. One is your response to the fact that you're facing a new price ratio, right? The exchange rate you're facing of Reese's against Hershey's is different. So part of your change in overall consumption is due to the fact that you're changing this different ratio of prices. And the other part of the response to this price change is going to be simply due to the fact that you have less real income, all right? You don't do this ever in practice. The only thing we ever observe is the price of Hershey's goes up. How does your optimal bundle, consumption bundle, or optimal number of Hershey's consumed change? There we go. By the end of the semester, I'm so going to own you, Surface Tablet. I'm going to figure out all your tricks. Okay, so what are you talking about, Max? I get it, right? So 2 things happening. I have less real income, and I'm facing a new exchange rate. So what does this really mean intuitively? Well, it means a bunch of things. if a good, let's just think about the substitution effect here. If you have two goods, and one good becomes relatively more expensive, just think about that exercise. Don't worry so much about details, just intuitively. Two goods, one good becomes relatively more expensive. Do you think just substitution-wise, are you going to go to the relatively more expensive good or the relatively less expensive good now? The relatively less expensive good. So the trick here, of course, and that's the thing that's going on in the back of your mind, I think, is one, well, but there is this weird income effect going on at the same time, so how do we actually show that? So the exercise we're going to do in our heads, and we're going to do this about 8 or 9 times, you're going to do it about 10 times in a problem set, and we'll spend the entire first review session on this because that's the questions you ask, and then I may not ask about it on the exam, that's the unfair part. But what we're going to do is the thought exercise is, imagine you're on an indifference curve, all right, a level of happiness. You figure out what the optimal consumption bundle is on that indifference curve. So you're at that point of tangency. Indifference curve, budget constraint, point of tangency right here. If I held your level of happiness constant, meaning we stayed on that indifference curve, and we don't worry about income for now, where would you be on that indifference curve? Turns out what you're going to do is you're going to roll the budget constraint around that indifference curve until you're now tangent to that new budget constraint with a new slope. And that ratio of Reese's to Hershey's, relative to the ratio of Reese's to Hershey's before, is going to be what we call the substitution effect. Max, I have no idea what you just said. That's okay. That's consistent with the way these things usually happen. So let's try and work through this step by step. Then I'm going to give you a process on how to figure this out graphically. I even brought a hot pink shoelace in order to demonstrate this. This will be a, look at this thing. Teaching tools from the 19th century. I don't know if they had neon in the 19th century, but we'll use that. I used to do this with lasers, but people can't see lasers. So let's do this. So it turns out it's much easier to draw a price drop than a price increase. All right. So what I'm going to work through, example by example, in class and in lecture, is how this works for a drop in one price. And then, of course, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing for a price increase on problem sets and in section and on the exam, right, to make sure you understand how it works the other way around too. So think about Hershey's and the price drops. Right. What I'm going to argue is that in a world where you hold your utility constant, right, and the price drops, what you're going to do is you're going to face a new exchange rate that favors the now relatively cheaper good, which is Hershey's, so you're going to substitute towards Hershey's, right? It's a utility constant substitution, and that makes a lot more sense when we start drawing that. But the substitution effect always works in the same direction, right? If I hold my level of happiness constant, I change the prices individuals face, they're going to substitute towards more of the relatively inexpensive good, meaning the substitution effect is always positive. It always goes in the same direction, towards the less expensive good. For a price increase, of course, it goes in the opposite direction. So if the price of Hershey's increases, you substitute away from Hershey's towards Reese's, but it always goes in the same direction. Now, if we've taken care of the substitution, and I'm now breaking my overall change into these two steps, right? Hershey's, because we're looking at a price drop, has become relatively less expensive, or have become relatively less expensive. But if I give you a lower price of Hershey's, your opportunity set grows, right? You have more real income. So as income grows now that you've taken care of the substitution effect, and you're just looking at the pure income change, what's going to happen to your consumption of Hershey's? Well, if income goes up, right, it's not clear whether you're going to consume more Hershey's or fewer Hershey's. So who here, if your income went up, would consume more Hershey's? All right, who here would consume fewer Hershey's? Anybody here? Yeah, there's somebody who thinks Hershey's are an inferior good, right? So it depends on whether Hershey's are a normal or an inferior good to you, whether this income effect, meaning this pocketbook effect of you simply having more real income, is going to turn you into an increased consumer of Hershey's, that's if Hershey's are a normal good for you, or a decreased consumer of Hershey's, which is when Hershey's are an inferior good. Are we having fun yet? No, not at all, Max. This is really bizarre, and I knew there was the trick. You'd start all the hateful economic stuff after the drop deadline, so I can't get out anymore, right? And you're exactly right. So. Okay. Let's draw some pictures. We love drawing pictures, okay? Actually, I don't anymore since I got this tablet, but I used to like drawing pictures. So let's think about a world here where, let's say, income is $10. The price of Reese's is 1, and the price of Hershey's is, let's say, 2. Okay? Reese's always go up here. Hershey's down here. So if income is $10, price of Reese's is $1. If I consume only Reese's, I can afford 10 bags of Reese's. If I consume only Hershey's, I can consume 5. So my budget constraint looks something like this. Okay, that's what my budget constraint looks like. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw an indifference curve that's tangent to that budget constraint. No, that's illegal. They're not supposed to have bumps like that. Here we go. So much easier to draw with chalk. I'm about to give up on this thing. There we go. Okay, so I think we agree that the optimal consumption bundle for this individual is somewhere near 3 Hershey's and somewhere near 4 Reese's. You've seen this picture about 25 times. If you're practicing at home as you should, you've seen it 100, 120 times. So what am I going to do now? I am going to drop the price of Hershey's. Okay? I'm going to drop the price of Hershey's to, let's say, $1 a bag. Okay? Price of Hershey's goes down to $1 per bag. So what happens to my budget constraint? Stays the same on the y-axis, right? I can still afford the same number of Reese's, but it rotates out on the x-axis. Where does it rotate to? It rotates to this point, right? I can now afford 10 bags of Hershey's. Okay, there we go. Here's my new budget constraint. That's pretty neat, Max. Now, what you knew to be true, right, from our demand derivation, I could figure out what my consumption bundle on this new budget constraint is. I just figure out, I go meditate on a mountaintop, I figure out what my indifference curve is, and I draw the indifference curve that's tangent to this budget constraint, and that gives me my new consumption bundle. That's the overall change in consumption of Hershey's in response to a price change. This is what we care about if we're advertising folks, if we're supermarket chains. It's an overall very useful response. We can derive quantities such as the price elasticity of demand from this overall move. It's really very neat. We could be happy going home with just that. But this is Berkeley, and this is intermediate micro, right? So I'm going to complicate your life a little bit. I'm going to come up with an intermediate stop there, right? I'm going to break that move from this budget constraint to this budget constraint into a first substitution effect and then an income effect. So the substitution effect what I told you is, what if you held your level of happiness constant, the level of utility constant at whatever you get here, right? In other words, what does that mean in terms of the indifference curve? We remain on this original indifference curve. So let's call this one I1. I1 right here. So let's stay on that indifference curve. But what consumption bundle would we consume if we were to face the new prices? Well, if we were to face the new prices right here, right, this lower price of Hershey's, that means my marginal rate of transformation is the slope of this new line right here, steeper than the old line. If I consumed the same consumption bundle as earlier, right, I could get on a higher indifference curve than before if I consumed this original consumption bundle here, so that can't be right. I want to stay on I1. So what I want is I want to figure out the point on I1 on this original indifference curve that has the same slope, the same marginal rate of substitution as the new budget constraint. How do I do that? Two ways. You either take your old budget constraint and you sort of rotate it like a cutting board around a salad bowl at the bottom, right? Or you simply take the slope of the new budget constraint, shift it in parallel, and figure out until you're right at that point right here where that imaginary budget constraint is tangent to the original indifference curve. So I'm going to draw a green line here, A, because I can, and B, because it's imaginary. We don't ever observe that budget constraint. It's not something that enters your decisions. It just allows me to break down our overall move from a substitution into a substitution and income effect. So where is that point? Shift the original budget constraint in parallel until it's exactly tangent to the original indifference curve. And that point is right here. Right? Let's check. This thing better be parallel to that one, correct? Right? So the marginal rate of transformation of the new budget constraint is exactly equal to the marginal rate of transformation of the this imaginary budget constraint right here. Only this imaginary budget constraint is tangent, exactly tangent to my original utility indifference curve right here. So what happened here, right? If I go from, let's call this one point A, this here is point A, to this point B here, did my level of utility, did my level of happiness change? No, right? It's the same. We're on the same indifference curve. But are you consuming a different bundle of goods at A versus at B? Yeah, right? So you are consuming fewer Reese's, and you are consuming more Hershey's. A little bit more than 4 here is the way I drew it. So what happened? I held my level of happiness constant. Right? I figured out the point where an imaginary budget constraint that has the same slope as my new budget constraint is tangent to my original indifference curve. And what this gets me is the move in Hershey's from this point 3 here to this point a little bit more than 4. This is holding my level of happiness constant. If I were to face the new prices, how many more Hershey's would I substitute towards? And it also tells me on the other axis, how many Reese's would I substitute away from? So in the world of Hershey's, this move from A to B, I call that my substitution effect. So that says SE down there. That's the substitution effect. Well, do we ever observe B? No. Right? I've told you that already. This is sort of an imaginary thought exercise here to break down the overall move into the impact of new relative prices versus an overall income effect. Well, Max, what do you mean by income effect? So what happens to a budget constraint if I give you more money? Should we do an exercise? All right. Any volunteers? All right, yeah, you're close. All right. So what would happen to your budget constraint if I gave you $5? So what would happen to its slope? Would it change? There you go. Here, enjoy your higher budget constraint. All right. So what happened is I just gave him $5. Right? To me, I see, the anticipated consumption of 2 soy lattes already. But all that happened in my mind is, what's your name again? I'm sorry. Paul. What happened to Paul is I see Paul as an x-axis and a y-axis, right? And Reese's and Hershey's on one side, and I just saw his budget constraint shift out parallel. All right? That's what I saw. Well, what on here is a parallel shift in budget constraints, right? So if I look at the beginning budget constraint with the high price of Hershey's versus the budget constraint I end up with the lower prices, that's not a parallel shift, right? The slope changes. But is there a parallel shift on here? Yeah, there is, right? The green budget constraint, if I shift that out parallel, let's do that again. Green budget constraint, shift that out parallel, I get exactly the black budget constraint. So now if I take my imaginary green budget constraint that tells me the bundle that takes care of the substitution away from Reese's towards Hershey's because of the change in the rate of transformation, now in order to get to the final consumption bundle, all I have to do is shift this green budget constraint out to get to my new budget constraint, which I've already drawn on here because my final budget constraint is here. So just one more time, I know it's annoying, but what you've got here is in order to get from B, hold on, my giant head is in the way here. So to get from B to the final consumption bundle, you just shift that imaginary budget constraint out. Well, Max, I'm still confused. Where on the new budget constraint do I consume? I don't know. If I were a courageous person, I would let Paul come up here and try and draw his own indifference curve, but I'm not going to do that, all right? So let me try and guess at Paul's indifference curve. How about, that's a good-looking indifference curve right there, all right? So what I'm saying is the level of consumption that Paul will enjoy at his new higher budget constraint is this bundle C right here, where he's going to consume roughly 5.2 Hershey's and roughly 4.8 Reese's. So let's just